Say when you want me to start.
Yes, we can start now. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome everyone. This afternoon, Erica Hunter is very kindly giving us a guided tour to something very exciting. Erica has taught at Cambridge, taught Syriac at Cambridge and then at SOAS in London. And she's taking us to West China, to a place called Turfan. And in the early 20th century, a whole lot of fragmentary manuscripts in Syriac were found there from a monastery of the Church of the East. Most of these just sat in Berlin for a very long time until Erica had the excellent idea of applying for a grant to catalogue them, which she and a colleague did. And one of these manuscripts is quite a long one, and it's on that manuscript, a liturgical manuscript, that she's going to introduce us to today. So Erica, over to you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sebastian, for your kind introduction, and thank you everybody for taking time out of what I'm sure are busy schedules to hear a small talk that will take us right over, as Sebastian has said, to Western China, to Turfan. And I'm going to screen share because I'm going to run a PowerPoint. I thought that was the best way to introduce the material. So let me do screen share. Back to where Turfan is, because for some of you, it may be very much terra incognita. We're in Western China, in the Uyghur or the Turkic-speaking areas of China. You've probably read something in the news about the current tensions in that region. Has been settled, of course, by Turkic-speaking peoples since the 8th century and CE, and prior to that, Iranian or Sogdian-speaking peoples. But it is a remarkable site because it is at this site, and you can see the photographs on the right-hand side, and also the photographs by Nureyev and myself. Just to recapitulate, Turfan, the western area, it's now known as the Uyghur Autonomous Region of Western China. It is, of course, part of the People's Republic of China. It has been inhabited by Turkic-speaking peoples since probably the 8th, 9th century CE, and prior to that, Sogdian or Old Iranian speakers. So it isn't primarily a Chinese-speaking area. That happens when we get to Dunhuang, which you can see here. The Hexi corridor is where the Chinese areas of Chinese-speaking areas. So it is a multilingual and multi-ethnic area. And in the early 20th century, there were 4 campaigns. The German Turfan expedition, of course, led by a very Prussian-looking Albert von Lecoq standing here, and Albert Grünewedel, who brought back from Turfan 40,000 fragments in 20 scripts and 22 languages. And they are all housed in Berlin, along with a lot of artistic fragments, etc. The second and third seasons, which are 1904 to 1907, found a monastery library, and I put that in quotation marks because we really don't know what it is. It might be a sort of a Geniza near Zipang, and it found 1,000+ fragments, all written in Syriac script, and there you can see the breakdown. Now, an addendum to this is that in 2021, the Chinese have excavated the monastery site that you can see. I always urge them to excavate, and they have found another almost another 500 fragments, but we've only had images of 3 or 4 released, so we don't know the range, but there is clearly Syriac material. We will have to await that material coming out of the excavations. And of course, the excavation reports, which preliminary indicate that there were two major stages between the 7th and the 12th centuries. And that is what we would tally with our paleographic and manuscript evidence. There was a later stage, but we think that that was a different usage. So 7th to 12th centuries is the sort of chronological range according to the archaeological reports, which I have not seen for the monastery. Now, one of the most important things finds, as Sebastian has mentioned already, is a very major, and when I say what they found in 500 fragments, they were fragments. Some of them as small as postage stamps, some of them bifolios. What you're seeing on the left, MIK 345, which is housed in Dahlem, which is now the Museum for Asiatische Kunst, has moved to the Insel Museum in Berlin, and I'm not quite up to date with what the name change is, but this was housed in Dahlem in Berlin. It is paper. All the fragments from Turfan are paper, which indicates that they're probably around 8th, 9th century, because that's when paper traveled westwards from China, where of course it was the place of its invention, westwards to the Middle East. So all the fragments of paper, we have no title pages and no colophons, but we do have one very substantial manuscript, which is 61 folios. And you can actually, those of you who are astute, can see it is still has its binding threads. So it shows the choir construction of this manuscript. Now, the script, Chip Coakley and I, Chip, of course, will be very well, very familiar to many of you. Chip Coakley and I worked on this fragment, and we published it in this book that in 2017. The script is described as East Syriac medial or post-Estrangela, and without going into technical detail, its letter forms and its use of diacritical points, which are not great, or what I should say, not considerable, put it into the development of the East Syriac script and point to a provincial scriptorium. Two hands prepared the manuscript. Chip and I think that we have plumped for a Central Asian provenance for this manuscript, not only based on the script, but also on the paper. I had paper analysis done by an expert from Denmark who looked at the fibers, because paper was made from plant fibers, and they pointed to Central Asian plants and not Chinese plants. We think, and it's only Chip and I think this, but we can't be categorically sure, but we think that the manuscript was probably written in a place like Marv, a very major metropolitanate of the Church of the East, and taken at some stage to Turfan. When, we don't know, but one thing that is for certain is the dating, and that is carbon-14 dating done at Oxford, 771 to 884. So it is very important because it places that manuscript at its time of writing in the 8th, 9th centuries. That doesn't mean it came to Turfan in those years, but that does pinpoint the place of writing. And it's 50 years before, I think, the earliest dated Syriac manuscript on paper. That would be interesting because it's showing, of course, the trajectory of paper production from China through to the Middle East. And surely the Christians were probably part of that transmission of technology. That's another question which we won't go into today. So we have this remarkable manuscript, 8th to 9th century. It is, Chip and I talked about it a lot. We called it a liturgical miscellany, which is why the title of the volume is called a Syriac service book. It was probably a hudra, which is the liturgical cycle of the Church of the East. And it's the end of the annual cycle. We think, and this is a calculation made on the choir arrangement, that was probably 200 leaves, but we only have 61. And of course, it's the daily offices and the Eucharist of the Church of the East. The monastery is clearly part of the Church of the East. What is important in terms of the dating which was established is that this manuscript appears to predate the recension from the upper monastery, that is, I think, early 10th century, and that lies behind the Textus Receptus of most East Syriac service books. And of course, the hudra in its modern form, which is still, of course, used in the Church of the East throughout the liturgical year, is largely derivative of 15th and 16th century recensions. But we have much valuable material in this manuscript and other liturgical manuscripts. There are probably 200 or 300 fragments from Turfan that are liturgical. A lot of work to be done. Just running through the contents, just to give you a flavour of what the contents are, you see from folios 1, and we put question 1 because of course it wasn't the first folio, up to 21a, and they are offices for the saints. And you can see outlined in or highlighted in red, Mart, Shir and her companions, Mar Barshabba and Zavandocht. And then we go on to Mar Sagis and Mar Bakos, who of course were the great military saints that had such an international reputation. But Mart, Shir and her companions, Mar Barshabba and Zavandocht, are peculiarly Central Asian. Going back, just for those who are interested, you have the latter part, the last 40 folios of the manuscript are the rite for the consecration of a new church, which is extremely interesting and detailed, anthems for ordinary days, and burial services, the most complete, I think, series of services that are extant for the Church of the East, and then oniata or anthems for various occasions, nativity, annunciation, drought, etc. So that gives you some idea of the contents of this remarkable manuscript. Let us, so the listing, if we go back to the observance for Mart, Shir and her companions, the listing commences with the lemma, and that's on page 191. I've put that up in red. First in the week of Mart, Shir, the evangelist, and it calls her specifically the Karadzutha. And I think that's a very interesting epithet accompanying the name of this queen. And it extols the achievements of the three saints in the sung offices or the recitations of the evening office. Now these, it seems, and I'm not a great expert on the music, but the whole, the liturgy would of course be very much sung. Mar Barshabba, Mart, Shir, of course, was a queen from the Sassanid court, Zoroastrian by birth, who was exiled from the court with her conversion to Christianity, and she was exiled to Marv, which was basically the garrison town at the end of the Sassanid Empire. Her brother husband, got her as far away as he could in the Sassanid Empire. We will come back to Mart Shir. Barshabba, very familiar to many people as the bringer or founder of Christianity at Marv, and reputedly the first bishop of this major metropolitanate. Marv was the gateway to the dioceses in Central and East Asia that went as far as the Chinese court in Xi'an. We know that it arrived in the 7th century, so it was a very, very important metropolitan. Zavandocht, we have very little information. She possibly was a lady in waiting to Mart Shir. All queens, of course, had ladies in waiting. Her name is Iranian, Zoroastrian in origin. We do find Christians with Zoroastrian names. We even have one of the monks on the Xi'an Full Stele that has what would have been originally a Zoroastrian name. And of course, the hagiography of Barshabba, which is not in this manuscript, but another one, tells of 3 ladies in waiting who repudiated Zoroastrianism along with their royal mistress. Well, ladies in waitings often had to do what their mistresses wanted, so who knows what were the circumstances, but we think that Zavandocht, very little information. I'm always searching for these shadowy characters, but anything I could find I'd be interested in. Now, Barshabba and Zavandocht are only introduced relatively late in the evening office before the festival. And this is on page 196, and I've put up the Syriac, and then it's on folio 11b to 12a, and it has this wonderful ornithographical or ornithological imagery, and it says 2 doves. Of course, that will be Mart Shir and Zavandocht, and 1 eagle, who is, of course, Barshabba, flew and came from Seleucia and Ctesiphon. They made a nest in the branches of the cross, a very living metaphor for the cross. The chicks grew and flew, singing the praises of the Lord. I think it's beautiful imagery. And then further down, we have a chant. It's after the recitation of Psalm 33:3. The liturgy is absolutely peppered with quotations from the Psalms. In the power of Jesus, they went out and came, the 3 of them, givers of his gospel to Merv, the eagle Barshabba, and Shir and Zavandocht, the doves. And here it qualifies what it hadn't qualified above. The nest, the church in Merv, the chicks, the baptized who sing. So this wonderful ornithological imagery and very lively natural imagery, I would say. Now, of course, as I've mentioned, in the opening heading, she is accorded the honor of being the evangelist, Karatsulta, who brought Christianity to Marv. As a royal woman, even if she was exiled, she was still a royal woman, and that would have still been well recognized. She could not assume the office of official office of a bishop. This, of course, was a male prerogative, as were all male public officers. So the task fell to Barshabba, who set up some type of church organization and probably cemented the links with the patriarchate in Seleucia Ctesiphon. But her royal connections are repeatedly referred to throughout the liturgy. In folio 12R, which is on page 196, it says, how glorious, how lovely, and it's a quotation of course, it's an introit from Psalm 84. How glorious the diadem and beautiful the crown that the Holy Spirit has plaited and put on the head of Queen Shir, and how much her noble soul rejoices in the band of apostles and priests and martyrs and confessors. In the place of the bed of kings that she has forsaken, she sits on a glorious throne in the kingdom at the right hand of the bridegroom of high heaven, at the feast which does not pass away. Blessed are you, Blessed Mother, you rejoiced in your children from baptism, that by your prayers they might be preserved from the hurts of the evil one, our enemy, and from all his hosts. And then further on page 198, in another chant, we have Blessed Queen Shir, who went out from the palace and left her diadem and honored state, and she loved the heavenly King. She believed the work of our Savior. Whoever leaves his property, I will reward 100-fold, and he will inherit eternal life. Let's go back. So we have very clear references within the liturgy to Mart Shir being of royal status, of which she forsake for the greater status of being with the Saviour. The efforts of Mar Barshabba and Zavandos. So it really doesn't say very much what she has done, but it does show clearly the link with Seleucia Ctesiphon and the very fact that she eschewed great luxury and honor and probably prestige. On page 196, we have another quotation which shows that the three of them names them, the just who were victorious in the contest. It shouldn't be context, it should be contest, who labored in the gospel and turned nations from error to the truth of their faith. Let their prayer be a wall to us and guard us from the evil one and his host. And you can see this whole question of guarding from the evil one is quite prominent in the liturgy. Now, discussing Mart Shir, Chip and I have already noted in our book on page 32 that it presents the liturgy, and this would have been recited, of course, by the faithful, a livelier memory of the woman evangelist than the literary tradition in which the glory of the evangelistic work belonged chiefly to the founding bishop of the city, i.e. Barshabba. The focus of the 9th century Arabic historiography, the Chronicle of Shir, was basically focusing on Barshabba, who was a Greek speaker, captured in Syria during the Shapur, the first campaign, and deported to Mesopotamia. It illustrates his conversion of the Queen, his organization of the church, and also his miraculous resurrection. And it's quite distinctive. Now, when he came to Seleucia Ctesiphon, in a trope that one often finds with holy figures, he cured one of the royal concubines at the palace at Seleucia Ctesiphon, gained royal favor, but fell out with the king when he cured his sister wife, the latter being Mart Shir, and she converted to Christianity. And of course, the king exiled her to Marv, where he married her off to one of his relatives. The Chronicle does tell about her activities that laid the foundation for Christianity at Merv. So it differs from the liturgy, which extols her conversion and her royal status. Prior to her exile, when she was at Seleucia Ctesiphon, she ordered that Mar Barshabba be elevated to a bishop In doing so, she was setting the sort of foundation of the church, because apparently, well, not apparently, there was none in situ after the martyrdom in 346 of Barshabba. So she was setting the organization and structure of the church. At Mart, she did draw up plans for a church. And of course, as we all know, this was quite the thing that royal ladies could do. They could be donors. And if one remembers at Cambridge, and I'm sure at Oxford, there are many royal ladies who founded colleges. They might not be able to do other things, but they could found institutions and churches. Interestingly enough, the church was to be named after the royal palace in Ctesiphon. So she must have harbored some feelings of connection, certainly wanted the connection. Now, when Barshabba arrived at Mart, he implemented the mechanics of faith, and the Chronicle tells us that he brought deacons and priests and liturgical books, all the things that you need practically to set up a church. And he consecrated an altar. Now, it's very interesting that MIK 345 has a whole section that I haven't dealt with here on the consecration of an altar. But we don't know whether that was used by Barshabba. We just don't know. And one wonders whether it was in Shir's church. I'm sure she put a lot of pressure on him. He engaged in baptism and cured the ill. And of course, baptism was of Zoroastrians. Now, the Chronicle of Sirf does present a very practical and pragmatic account. It certainly differs in its focus to the liturgy of MIK 345, which was sung at Turfan, and it certainly has a Central Asian flavour. So we think that Chip Coakley and I think that what MIK 345 preserves is a rare insight into the cult of saints in Turfan. They also, of course, remembered the great saints of the church. The next section is on Sergius and Bacchus, and that is very fitting. It reproduces many of the details that are found in the Passio. But here we have, in prime position in the commemoration of the saints, three figures who are intricately and instrumentally linked with the bringing of Christianity to Central Asia. So I'm going to leave it here, and we can possibly have some discussion about this very interesting episode that is part of a liturgy that was undoubtedly sung. I have it back. We go back. You can see this lovely fresco, which is now in Berlin, shows a Western-looking priest. A lot of debate as to how Western he was. Was he a Sogdian or was he a Syrian? And the ladies, but certainly the ladies would represent the type of faithful who would have sung the liturgy. And it's very interesting that the prominence is given to a female saint. Now, whether it is because of her gender or because of her royal status that you would give precedence to someone of royal status is a question still to consider. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Erica, extremely, for this wonderful introduction to this fascinating world of Turfan and all the things that have turned up there. Well, we've got time for questions. Can either do it through chat, or I think that's probably, I'm not sure how best to do it, and comments. So open to the audience, the readership, as it were.
Shall I stop share? Or
I think, yes, I think if you stop sharing,
Right.
then I think then, yes, people can indicate through, what is it called, reactions, I think, if put a hand up if they've got a question otherwise they can. Yes, we've got one hand.
Susan, that's a very interesting comment, and I would, maybe you can email to me later. I'd be really interested to pick up the Ephraim imagery, because that's really interesting, because the Turfan fragments do mention Ephraim. He's not unknown. We don't have quotations from Ephraim, but they do mention Ephraim, along with the great fathers, of course, of the Church of the East. The great pillars of the Church of the East. So it's possible that there is a resonance, and I'd be really interested to trace that. Now, as regards who actually sung the liturgy, that's very difficult to know. But we do have mentions, of course, in the burial services, which I mentioned are the most complete of all Church of the East burial services. It's from the from the bishop down to the lay men and women. So the liturgy at MIK 345 in the consecration of the altar is also talking about lay men and women. So they are not just male oriented, they're quite gender inclusive, if I put those terms. Who actually sung the liturgy? I'm afraid I can't tell you, but it is interesting that the lay women are not excluded in mention as participants in the liturgy.
Thank you.
Tiny little fresco, which is like A4 size, that's much bigger on screen than in actuality. That's in Berlin, and it's of the three women with some type of Western priest. And I don't think that can be coincidental, that you have this fresco. So, but what one makes of it is, of course, there's been much discussion, but I just don't think it's incidental. But what struck me and Chip was the prominence given to Mart Shir. It's certainly a Central Asian saint. It gives a Central Asian flavor. I just don't know whether it is her royal status, and one would do that out of deference. I mean, for example, you'd never put Queen Elizabeth, Her Majesty, behind someone else. You would always put her at the head. In modern UK, even though it's moving in various directions. So whether it is just deference to her royal association, but it's very clear that there is a commemoration of her, and I'm hoping that we might pick up further material whenever the Chinese will release whatever they have found. But that
one thing that struck me looking at the image of the manuscript, the bifolium, the opened manuscript, was that the scribe was extremely competent in that his left justification is very good. And if you've ever tried to write something with left justification in Syriac or right justification in English, it's jolly difficult. Because you have to think ahead of the spacing. And this manuscript is remarkably good at having a straight line, vertical line at the ends of the lines. Some of the letters are extended, but there are all sorts of other things that can go wrong. You come across a word that's too long and you're not allowed to break the word in the middle, at least not until rather late in Syriac tradition. So I'm very impressed by this.
Yeah, he's very definitely a good hand, but very occasionally he does make a slip up, because I looked at folio 12A when it talks about Barshabba and Shir and Zavandocht, and I thought, have I forgotten the Syriac, the end of the word? And he'd split, he obviously wasn't so familiar with that name, and it's Zavand, and then with the D, and then the wow, calf, T, the ocht, of course. So very occasionally, but it is clearly, as you say, a very fine piece of work. I can only think, I really, my feeling is, of course, we don't have categorical proof that it was not produced at Turfan, that there must have been major scriptoria in Marv, and it was produced and taken there. What is fascinating is in the handful of images which the Chinese have released, there is one fragment that we're fairly sure, and I've run it past a few people, maybe even you, Sebastian, I can't remember now whom I've run it past, but Ma'awa I ran it past, and it's the same hand as MIK 345. He thinks from looking at it that it is part of MIK 345. How these manuscripts were deposited in one room, and that's where they were found, literally taken out of the ground in one room, we don't know. It could have been a Geniza, like in the Jewish tradition where you didn't destroy texts, but this is certainly the largest. So we are hoping, of course, for the history of the Hudra, because so much of the previous contents of the Hudra have we just simply don't have. It could be very informative, but we wait until these results are released. But it is the earliest, I think, without accepting that very small potsherd that was found at Ein Shire, which you kindly corrected my translation, which is probably 7th, 8th century, and that looks to be an excerpt from the Hudra. This is the earliest Hudra. And it is interesting because I don't think that the commemoration of Mart Shir is found in other Hudras. So it is a very particular to the area.
Yes, thank you. More questions, comments? I suppose one of the reasons to support your view that it came from Mav and not was written at the monastery is that had it been written at the monastery, you wouldn't have all the burial things for lay people at the end of the manuscript, whereas if it had been done elsewhere, it might have originally been intended for, well, a particular church or something, which is what often is the case with the Hudra.
And also the consecration of a new altar.
Yes, yes.
That it clearly indicates. And actually, what's interesting is, and I haven't put up this excerpt because it's a different story, we might say, which remembers Barshabba very clearly, the prayer of Barshabba in this consecration. But what is it's if the altar is reused. So it isn't just a new altar, but that sometimes they must have taken altars from one church to another church. But so I think that this is an instruction manual, or some type of complete manual, and also Ma'awa, looking at the size of it, said it was much smaller. It is much smaller than the actual, the Hudra is huge, as of course we all know. And I wonder whether it was something that was produced at Marv for dissemination amongst those clergy who were going out into various regions and establishing new churches.
Yes, yes, it sounds very plausible.
Because it has these, I mean, as Chip said, the burial services are very long and complete, and when you're dead, you're really dead after they've been recited, because they're very long, but they are the most complete and extending through all the categories of people. The sons of the covenant, for example, are mentioned at Turfan.
Yes, that's interesting.
What interested me was this focus on the Queen, the memory. And there is a clear memory at Turfan of the Mesopotamian origin of the church. That is shown not only in this liturgy, but in the Sogdian material, which is the hagiographies in the Sogdian material, which are all relating back to the great saints of the church. So there is, although the Syriac material was translated into Sogdian, but we don't have the Syriac originals of the Sogdian material. So that's an enigma. But Nicholas Sims Williams, of course, who's the great authority, says without doubt all the Sogdian hagiographies are translated from Syriac. Of course, many other ascetical works and mystical works also appear in Sogdian, of course, catering for what the monks would have read, their native language, rather than Syriac, which had a liturgical and special function. Syriac would not have been spoken at Turfan. So when the people sung this liturgy, one doesn't know how much they actually knew, but I wonder whether there was some sort of, cult's not the right word, but memory of Mart, Shir, and so, but it is important to note that the faithful probably did not have, the laity would not have had a good command of Syriac, but they would have participated in the liturgy, which was always sung in Syriac.
Yes, I think it's often true that people, the singers anyhow, in Syriac churches could read Syriac very fast, impressively fast, but not have all that much understanding of the content. And I'm reading George Kiras's autobiography, and he says when he learnt to sing that he was taught how to read very fast without at that stage knowing what he was reading.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm sure that was the case. So anyway, we have a remarkable collection of the Church of the East in Western China. And what I always say to people, and those who've heard me speak before will realize I always say it because it is so important. If we did not know the provenance of this material, you would place it in northern Mesopotamia. It is the provenance of Turfan that really pins it. And of course, it's only the accidental discovery. And I think this was no archaeological survey. The Germans probably were tipped off by some villager and they went in one day and just pulled all this out. I mean, it's a disgrace in archaeological technique, but that's what you did at the beginning of the 20th century. And so, of course, techniques have changed. I have to say the Chinese are very disparaging, but you know that was what people did. We wouldn't do it now. But it's so important to know that this is is indicative of how the church organized itself in its distant provinces. It gives us a real snapshot into what the communities read. It does show very clearly their acquaintance and acknowledgement of the northern Mesopotamian monastic tradition and ascetic tradition. And so it is a very important insight into a whole arena which isn't even mentioned by the Church of the East records. So it complements that lacuna, which they probably did, but these records have been lost. So it's a really important, it puts a really important piece in that puzzle of how the church operated in Central and Eastern Asia. And we're very fortunate to have it all digitized in Berlin. You can all look at it online, and it's all been catalogued, but it hasn't been translated. So there's a lot of work to do.
Yes, there are plenty of puzzles still which need solving.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Yes, and the fact that there's so many Khudra fragments implies that there must be a lot of local churches in that area.
Yes.
Because you, in a monastery, you only need one at a time, as it were.
Well, I can't remember how many different hands. Mark Dickens, of course, who was a great person to work with, Mark and I, on paleographic grounds, identified, I think, 17 or 20 hudras. So, as you say, it's indicative of enterprise. We just don't know how it was related. However, and I have omitted to say this, the Chinese were busy digging in 2021 because they crossed the Tian Shan Mountains, which the Uyghur kings used to do in the 8th and 9th centuries, to the summer place of Beiting, a fabulous site. I've been there twice, and found a very major Christian church, and that's Rongxinjiang from Beijing. Apparently there are inscriptions, etc. So I think if the Chinese are interested and keep up, and of course we have the connections with Dunhuang, we might find a whole network. And but this is also material, but they didn't publish any fragments, so we don't know what has come out. But there is apparently a major Christian church.
Oh, that's fascinating. Susan has another question. Susan.
I quite agree, and I also think the liturgy is performing an extremely important function, which is often overlooked in the fact that it is historical memory. We've become so secularized, we don't tend to think of liturgy in that way, but here it is very clear there is a historical memory, and it comes through in the references not only to Ctesiphon but also in other liturgical fragments to the great interpreters, to Ephraim, to Manasseh, etc. So the liturgy is performing this role, and people may not understand the verbs, etc., but probably the names would be familiar with them, and they might have, discussions in Sogdian, etc., about the names. So the names would be a resonance, and I think this role of liturgy as historical memory, which is why I tried to write this article for Entangled Religions, to point out that it has not just an aspect of faith, which is, of course, and the meaningfulness of the liturgy and the particularity, as you mentioned, even if you don't understand that importance, but also as connections, historical connections. And I think it conveys a very different perspective to later writers such as the Chronicle of Shir, where you get a more historical aspect. But the liturgy does have a historical thread. Well, I just hope that I've intrigued you enough to have a look at a fabulous episode. The church in Central Asia and China was there for a millennium. That's a long period of time. Very active, multilingual, multicultural, and yet it maintained its trajectory back to Mesopotamia. So it is, as I say, a paradigm for communities today who are in multicultural, multilingual environments, that they have the trajectory back to the Mesopotamian homeland.
What would be interesting to know is if modern Chinese Christians ever sort of go back to this early period or try to make connections. I've no idea.
There certainly is an interest, and there is certainly an interest that didn't disappear with the end of the Tang dynasty and then re-emerge with the Yuan, who were Mongols. I am told by that many Mongolians are now really interested in their early Christian history, and I think perhaps things are more reserved in China on an official level because, of course, the attitude to religion being so negative. But I get the feeling that there is great interest, and particularly as it is considered to be an intrinsic or indigenous form of Christianity, not coming from the West, though of course it was an import along with Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism. Of course, it was an import to China. But I am told that there is an interest, but of course, the official levels, it's very difficult to deal with.
See, it's just about time for us to quit. So thank you very much, Erica, for this fascinating journey, taking us all the way in our armchairs to Western China.
Yes, I just wish we could all have a tour. I have been there a few times.
You've actually been there. I've been there.
Oh, and Beijing, most beautiful sight. I understand why the Uyghur Khans went from Turfan in summer to the cooler, beautiful site. No, if I could, I'd be very happy to take us all. We'll have to see.
Wonderful. So thank you again very much. There, that you've got the date for the next month, haven't you? I haven't got the details with me.
Yes, thank you very much. I just put in the chat the reminder that next meeting will be on the 25th of August, and we have Professor Susan Harvey who is with us.
Oh yes, that's
so,
right.
Yes,
Wonderful. That's
Jacob of Serug.
much looking forward to that, Susan. Thank you. So, goodbye till then.
Yes, cheerio. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much, Erica. That's very good.